Welcome to a Homegrown Family Podcast, where we grow the produce and the kids. Hey, welcome everybody to a Homegrown Family Podcast. Like you see in the introduction, we talk about garden produce and raising kids. Well, I haven't gotten to the kids portion yet. We're getting there, I promise. We're going to kind of follow suit here with the current trend of raising produce, kind of self-sufficiency, and that narrative. So if you listen to and have been listening, you notice that in previous episodes, like Lady in a Sunday Dress, we talk about my mom, how she grew up, and the type of garden that my grandparents had, and the type of garden that she had. She had a really big garden. And the good old days is the episode with my grandma. If you haven't listened to that one, man, we've gone a long way since the early days, and it's only been 50, 60 years, from this change. It's crazy. The industrial age, I tell you. So, yeah, we're going to kind of follow suit there and kind of continue on with this gardening topic. But what follows the garden is usually what you do with your produce, right? And this time of year, everybody up here in the Midwest is kind of like, all right, holding on to their garden as long as possible, trying to get those last little peppers ripe, right? Anyways, today I have a guest that you are all familiar with, the one and only David.
Hello.
The topic today is going to go into a little bit more food preservation. So we've been talking a little bit in recent podcasts about harvesting grapes, and David's a big part of that. We talked about the origin of the orchard. And so a lot of the grapes we use are for wine, but also used for fresh eating and making juice, like I kind of mentioned in the previous episode. Today, I kind of want to take a little bit of time to talk about food preservation and canning our juice primarily. We also do freeze some also, but we're going to focus in on the canning thing. With grandparents and parents that had big gardens, we learned at a young age that we don't always have to go to the store for our food. I think as a kid, mom and dad didn't really buy produce from the store very often as far as vegetables, fruits. Mom and dad bought fruit, right? She had oranges quite a bit and bananas. She always almost has, and still today, we almost go home every time for the weekends and stuff, and there's almost always a little thing of banana sitting on the table.
I think it was a lot of what was in season, though, too, growing up. We had lots of apples in the fall, right? There wasn't any other fruit around during apple season. Or, when there was June berries to pick or strawberries. I mean, it was kind of what went with the season. Mom and dad certainly didn't go and buy produce that was off-season expensive, shipped in from who knows where.
True. Yeah, and that's interesting that you mentioned that, David, because there's been podcasts that Nora's been listening to, my wife, and she tells me about these things that she's been listening to because I always don't have a time to catch up on the latest and greatest. But one of the things she's been talking about is that there's this trend of buying local and buying in season, right? So if you're not going to buy from a local farmer or a local co-op or something like that, or get your eggs, from the neighbor down the road, but at least buy the fruit that's in season, rather than trying to buy the expensive, I don't know, mangoes or strawberries in February and things like that. But so yeah, growing up as kids, a lot of green beans. My mom did a lot of canning of green beans. She did a lot of canning of freezing corn mostly, but canning wise, it was beans. We did buy a lot of baked beans. We had that fairly often too. So that was one vegetable I guess that mom did buy fairly often. What else, David, that mom always canned for us?
Red beets, dill pickles.
Yeah.
She usually bought lugs of peaches, sometimes pears to can also.
Oh, when the 4-H fruit came in and stuff like that. Yeah. Or fundraisers from school events, nephews and nieces that are selling fruit. She'd always get a box of pears and can it up. That was always a treat.
She'd do applesauce once in a while. She didn't can a lot of applesauce. I mean, that's another one that I tend to freeze more instead of canning. But
chili sauce. Mom always made chili sauce.
Chili sauce, spaghetti sauce, salsa.
Did a lot of different things. So, I mean, yeah, even that type of stuff, anything tomato-based, Mom pretty much canned up. And so to this day, a lot of my siblings, I think probably David and my sister Liz are probably the biggest canners of us all. The others don't necessarily have garden access at the time or currently living in apartments or just don't have a very suitable yard space for it. David's taken on the reins a little bit as far as canning thing goes. You've gotten a larger and larger garden as the years go by.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you, Liz. I think Liz said she did like 80 quarts of spaghetti sauce or chili sauce or something like that this year. That was way beyond what I did with tomatoes this year. So Liz can take that award. I probably do can the most juice, jelly, that type of stuff. Maybe salsa, I guess.
Oh, yeah, jelly and jam. That was another big one that my grandparents and our mom was always kind of into.
Oh, she never bought any jelly or jam from the store.
Oh, yeah. Yep. And the thing is you make a batch of jam or jelly, you got, 20 pints of this jam or 20 half pints of this jam. And unless you eat PB&J 3 times a week, it's going to take you a year and a half to 2 years to eat all that.
Yeah, generally a single batch. I mean, it depends on the recipe, right? A lot of times they're looking at 4 pints in a batch. Sometimes I'll double it and do 8 pints because you can fit that in your can or two.
Yeah, right. If you're going to heat up the house in the middle of summertime, you might as well make it worth it.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Personally, I haven't done a lot of canning recently. I think I did like a zucchini relish that turned out like a sweet relish that turned out pretty good. Was it last year? Because I had some extra zucchini, right? And I have a small garden, so I live in town. But I'm still one of the siblings that mooch. It sounds like I need to mooch off of Liz a little bit and trade some of my wine in for some spaghetti sauce. But my wife's mom, she also does a fair amount of canning, and so I get a lot of green beans from her and spaghetti sauces and things too. So I've got plenty of spaghetti sauce to go around too. But
I guess as far as canning goes, we learned the basics watching Mom growing up, but we really didn't get into it, until you get your own garden that actually produces enough vegetables. You're really not going to get into canning. It's just not worth the time and effort unless you have a large quantity of vegetables to preserve. But for myself, I enjoy it. I've done the basics from what Mom taught us, or met recipes from Mom, the dill pickles, the green beans. Started with the basic salsa recipe and then kind of expanded on it, right? It's always fun to do different things.
Yeah, what's your newest addition to your salsa, or is that top secret?
No, not top secret. It's kind of like making stir fry. It always turns out a little different for me. Actually, I've tried things like roasting the tomatoes or the peppers, trying to get a little smoky flavor. But I figured out that the easiest and laziest way to do it is just to put in like a tablespoon of liquid smoke. And it turns out okay. I
That's
like
good.
It just depends on who you are. This last time I did actually measure it, a tablespoon. So next time, if it's too strong or not strong enough, I can remember that. The last batch Joe was taste testing, I just kind of glugged it, and yeah.
Well, in my comments originally, I was like, David, it kind of tastes like I'm eating a steak right now on my chip. Like, where's the meat?
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it. Like the whatever Brandon called it, the Heinz 57 steak sauce or whatever, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, so I think it'd go great on some loaded nachos.
Yes.
A little bit of that salsa on top would be delicious.
Yeah, no, I would agree. So yeah, I guess one of the big things, and Joe's already alluded to it, is doing juice, right? What do we do with all the juice that we press?
The apples and the grape juice and yeah.
Yes, yeah, we've talked about it here earlier, just the other day, that this year we've pressed over 200 gallons of juice between grapes and apples. Now, some of that we sold to someone who was making wine, but a lot of it we end up either drinking fresh or canning. And I think myself, I canned over 20 gallons of apple and maybe about 10 of grape. And so Mom must have did a fair amount also.
I think Mom did about 15 gallons.
Okay.
Maybe even 20.
Yeah. And Joe, of course, does a lot of brewing also. So, I mean, that's where, 60-some gallons probably went?
Yeah, yep. But yeah, so let's talk about canning juice. So what do we do to start off with? What kind of supplies in general? Or Dave, why don't you just walk us through your process and kind of go from there?
Yeah, so I think you've already had an episode talking about how we make juice.
Yep. We have 5-gallon pails ready to go. It's kind of where we're at, and so you can take it from there.
Yeah, so this last weekend I was actually just pressing at my own house here down in Renville. And so I just went straight from the hydro press, pressing out the apple juice straight into a kettle to warm it up. And that's kind of how I start my process is.
Right. So the hydro press is what I referred to as the bladder press last episode. So
Okay.
David has the more technical term.
I don't know if it's more technical or not. That's what I call it. But anyway, so once I get about 3 gallons or so of juice in my bucket, I'll switch the pails out and bring one inside and pour it into a large kettle to warm up. Because once I wash my jars and everything's warm, I don't want to be pouring cold juice into warm jars and putting the jars with cold juice inside of my hot water bath canner that has warm water in it. I don't want to crack the glass by stressing it or changing the temperatures too drastically. So I like to warm up the juice first and then put it into the jars and then into the warm hot water bath because I have that kind of warming up as I'm getting other things ready. Otherwise, It takes a long time to go from cold juice and cold water to getting a hot water bath going. It just takes a long time. Okay, so for canning juice, the first thing you got to do is make sure that all of your supplies are clean and sanitized going into the process. So generally speaking, I'll just get a nice sink full of Dawn dish soap, hot water, wash up my jars, rinse them off so there's no residue on them, anything like that. And same thing with the lids, rinse them off again. And while we're doing that, generally speaking, on the stove, I'll have my water warming up in my hot water bath canner. And also I'll have another little pot there with some water heating up to put the lids in. Generally speaking, you'll throw your lids in this little, what I do is put it in a little pot on the side. And you want to boil your lids for, I think, 10 minutes, right? You're sterilizing the lids. And also you're warming up the rubber on the rim there to get a better seal when you're canning. And for the jars, after I'm done washing and rinsing them, I just flip them over so nothing's floating around and landing in my jars until I'm ready to use them. And for the juice, right, we already have the juice pressed, and so that goes into another large kettle, preferably something that for juice purposes can hold up to like 3 gallons, right? Because I'm going to be canning 4 half-gallon jars at a time in a 7-quart hot water bath canner. And unfortunately, that's all you can fit in there. I'm sure there's other larger canners out there that you could maybe fit more in there, but I use half-gallon jars because what's the point in canning quarts of juice?
Sure.
I mean, unless you live by yourself, I mean, my kids are going to drink one of those jars every day. Yes.
I'd take a couple pints.
Yeah. Yeah, you can just get a little pints. You can take them to work with you and stuff. And
that's what I did. I was basically the fresh juice I brought home from the fridge and poured it into a pint jar, brought it to work, and then.
See, there you go. I actually looked into that once. Little bottles that you could seal and bring to work and stuff. That just didn't. It wasn't cost effective to do that.
Yeah, and I know sometimes when I have canned, I'll also take the jars too, because your hot water bath is going to be boiling soon, and so I will dip my jars into the hot water bath, let them boil for 5 minutes. I mean, then you deal with, hot oven mitts with getting wet and steam and all that stuff, so you can sometimes burn yourself. But I definitely, take them out of the hot water bath, and then after that, I usually put them upside down after that. And so I usually do a little extra step, I guess, perhaps. But
it's a good practice to sterilize your jars too. I'm just lazy sometimes, and I haven't gotten sick yet. So
well, that's one thing too, is that some people might be listening and thinking, oh, you should really use a pressure cooker, to get a certain pressure and a certain temperature and this and that. Our grandma used a hot water bath kettle. My mom used a hot water bath kettle. We use a hot water bath kettle. Like, it's tried and true. I mean, we haven't had any issues with botulism in our canned goods or anything like that yet. You gotta keep an eye out for it. If you see something little floaties in there, you obviously don't eat it.
There's a point to that. If you read like the Ball canning guidebook, they'll talk in there about what foods should be pressure canned and which foods are safe to just use a hot water bath. And it has to do with the acidity of the foods, right? So that's why sometimes you'll add vinegar to things, and you have to have so much acid in that vinegar to be used for canning. And I think I actually heard or someone sent me an article not too long ago that there's actually vinegar on the shelves now that is below that standard level of acidity needed for canning. So that's something people should be aware of, is you got to make sure, I think it's like 5% maybe it needs to have.
And I think the current jugs of vinegar are like 4.5.
Yeah, right. So it's supposed to be 5% or higher to be used for canning.
Yep.
So things like beans should be used or canned with a pressure canner, and it doesn't take as long. But you can also use a hot water bath, and it just takes longer to do it.
And I know the juice that we're working with to test pH during the wine making or juice cider making process, and our pHs are like anywhere from 3.2 to 3.7.
They're pretty low. I think we're safe on the grape juice.
Yeah, and then we talked about the Star Sand sanitizer that I use. I actually measured pH on that the other day with my 5-gallon, 10-gallon solution I had. It could get a little bit more acidic, more or less, depending on how much you actually put in to mix it. But it came out at, I think, 2.4.
Okay.
So, it wasn't like, 1 pH doesn't seem like a lot, but maybe it is a fair amount. I don't know.
Well, it does come out to a lot, right? When you look at the pH scale.
It goes to like the 10th.
It's logarithmic. Yep.
Yeah, right. So it is actually a lot of a difference.
Yep.
Yeah. So we got these jars and everything, pots boiling, the jars are sanitized, and.
Oh, right. Yep. So we pour the juice into the jars. You want to make sure that you leave airspace right at the top of the jar. Maybe a 1/4 inch or so at the top of the jar, and that's so your liquid, your juice, when it's boiling, it's going to bubble inside the jar when you're cooking it in there. And that juice, if you fill it too full, is actually going to force its way out of the jar, actually. And sometimes you'll get your lids will actually kink up if you fill it too full, too. And you'll see, I've noticed it sometimes. I'm guilty of it. I fill them a little too full sometimes. And you'll have discolored water in your canner because some of the juice leaked out the top. It's like, oh, okay, that one was a little too full. So yeah, little bit of headspace there, 1/4 inch, something like that. And you're going to want to hand tighten your rims onto the jars once your lids are on there. And one of the things you want to do before you put the lids on is just take a washcloth that's clean, right? You haven't used it yet. And you just want to wipe the rim just to make sure there isn't something on the rim that would prevent the lid from seating there and getting a seal on it. There can't be, well, it's juice, right? So you're not going to have something like if you're canning salsa and you spilled a little bit on the rim, you're not going to have like a piece of seed or something there that prevents it from sealing. So juice, you're pretty safe, maybe not wiping the tops of the jars, but that's a good practice when you're canning to do that. Also, before you start, make sure your tops of your jars don't have like a chip or something, so that it won't seal then either. So then you put them in the hot water bath. So general rule of thumb for hot water bath for things like jellies and juices, I'm going to say, is you're looking at 20-minute hot water bath for pints, 25 minutes for quarts. And so for the 1/2-gallon jars, I do 30 minutes. And, it's just looking right logically at the volume or the mass inside each individual jar and how long it might take to heat it up all the way, right? When you're looking at those individual big jars. Because you're trying to heat it up from the outside of the jar, right? To get all the way into the interior of the jar, kind of, so to speak.
Yeah, so is it fundamentally the reason of the hot water bath is just to help seal it? Or is it actually to kind of bake or cook the products also? To some degree, you're cooking your green beans so they soften up a little bit. But in terms of juice, you don't really need to cook anything, do you? Or,
No, honestly, for the juice, I think it's more so help making sure that it's going to seal. But also I look at it as kind of maybe a last step sanitizing, make sure everything's cooked off and dead. So that's kind of what I look at it like.
Yeah, we talked about how we wanted to put the Cameron tablets in just in case, but the process of canning does essentially cook your bacteria and things like that off and everything. And so one question I have, or one of my listeners might have, is how much water do you put in your hot water bath, or how high do you want your water over your jars, or do you put water over your jars? How much water you put in there relative to your jars?
So Again, my hot water bath canner is probably not as large as it should be for a half-gallon jar, and I can't actually cover the jars entirely because of that. My canner's not tall enough. For pints and quarts, I have no issues. I can cover them with some water, right? So that's best practice, I would say, is to have water covering the jars by an inch or two if you have the space available. For my canner, I really can only get up to, the neck of the jar, really, for my canner. I'd have to have a taller canner to be able to do any more than that. I've never had any issues with juice not sealing, really. It seems like, you have the lid on the canner, so you are getting a lot of heat and a lot of steam going in there that should still, loosen up the rubber on the top there if you didn't already with the boiling of them. Never had any issues.
Yeah, that's actually, I talked to Mom about this the other day because I was going to see if she wanted to do this episode, but she said that she also doesn't usually put the water over the jars. We talked about how stuff in the jars can seep into the solution around the jars, or the water around the jars. Well, in theory, then, if you have a little nick in your lid that you didn't see, stuff from inside the hot water bath could seep into your jars also if you do cover them all the way. Is a theory possibly.
I'm following the thought process, but if there's going to be something leaking into your jar, I don't think it's going to seal.
Right.
Like there's something wrong with it that with either with the jar or the lid that it won't seal, because if your rim's on there, tight enough, it's really not going to be able to get in right when you're boiling and stuff. It's going to be forcing stuff out, if anything. So I really don't think that would be possible, but I follow the thought process.
Yeah. So, it's just like another potential risk of, contamination possibly, or if it doesn't seal, prevent sealing, and then you got to try to recan it or just decide to eat fresh all of a sudden, or whatever. But yeah, so then you give it a cook for, 20 to 30 minutes.
Yep.
And there's usually a little tiny tool you can use that you can buy at any of your canning goods stores or hardware stores that you can use to actually pull the lids out, pull the jars out. It's kind of like it's kind of like a tongs, but built to go around a jar. And so you pull it out with that so you're not touching hot things. And they also sell like a little utensil that has like a little magnet on the end that you can use to grab your lids, when you're boiling them in the water, and then use that without being able to touch your lid. You can actually set it on without touching, any of the rubber pieces or anything like that too. So.
Yeah, they usually sell those as a set. You get a little box. There'll be a funnel, that little magnet stick like you were talking about, the thing to grab things with. There'll even be a tongs in there. There's usually something else also to measure the airspace on top to see if you're actually, leaving enough air.
Yeah.
Or if you're leaving.
I think I saw that tool and I was like, who needs this?
Yeah, right. I never use it, but if a person wanted to gauge, if they've never done it, maybe it'd be a good to have.
Yeah, I shouldn't make fun of you if you're going to listen to this podcast and decide to can some juice. Go ahead and use a spacer. If you don't have a lot of experience, we won't judge you.
Not too harshly.
But until you get an eye for how much that is, it's good practice to maybe start off with.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's a pretty simple process, really.
To me, juice is about one of the easiest things you can. You're literally just pouring juice into a jar and boiling it.
You're not cutting up peppers, and you're cutting up, garlic or anything like that. You're not trying to put so much seasoning salt in there or anything, or none of that, so keep it simple.
Even jelly. Jelly, you got to add pectin and sugar to anyway.
Yeah, that's one thing, David, that I've been trying to, little segue here, I guess. I've been trying to take some of this juice and, put some pectin in it, I think. Either I put gelatin or pectin, I can't remember. I think I put gelatin. It's probably why it didn't turn out. But I tried to make some homemade Jell-O out of this juice, so that way it's a nice, home-produced product of Jell-O for my daughter versus, something Jell-O that you just buy from the store that's full of a bunch of sugar. So I put some natural sugars and try to make some Jell-O out of it as a kind of a nice snack. And if you make it to that really, really hard Jell-O, like a super pectinized Jell-O, it actually won't melt your hands very much. But I tried to make that, and I can never get it to set. And I don't know if it's because I was using gelatin because I had it at my house. Someone told me that I should probably use pectin instead. And if you use twice the amount of pectin, you might be able to get it to be a little bit harder, so that way it doesn't actually like melt very easily. But
I have no idea. Sounds like a
Hey.
good idea, though.
So those of you guys listening, if you ever made homemade Jell-O using juice, not from a store, email me and tell me how you do it. I want your recipe to try it out, because I failed at it like 2-3 times, and I'm like, this is ridiculous. So that's being said, my email is homegrownfam@gmail.com. I'm on the same exact Instagram, homegrown fam on the Instagram. Yeah, it's kind of catchy. But yeah, feel free to reach out if you have any questions about this hot water bath stuff. I might have to chit chat with David about it, but I can get you some answers in terms of if you have any questions, or if you're like, hey, I haven't found a really good salsa recipe. You mind sharing yours? I could probably sneak that off, David, maybe, and get a little. But like I said, every little batch changes it, and it's a little bit different. But I digress. Anyways, appreciate everybody for listening. Quick and easy episode on canning juice. There you have it.